The flip effect. It was once a cornerstone of Yu-Gi-Oh! And flip monsters were widely spread amongst the competitive meta decks. But in today's Yu-Gi-Oh!, many have forgotten that the mechanic even exists. It's been exactly 3 years since the last time we saw flip effect monsters being commonplace in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! With the release of Duelist Alliance and the Shadow archetype, and you'd have to go back many years prior to that for Gravekeepers and Storm of Ragnarok to find another YCS or Shonen Jump winning flip deck. But what if I told you that that wasn't always the case? What if I told you there was once a time in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where setting a flip effect monster was more practical than normal summoning, a time when flip monsters were on top of the world and even shaped the metagame? Today, I'm going to tell you a story of such a time. Today, you'll be learning about one of the strongest flip decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, Chaos Return, a deck that not only won multiple Shonen Jump championships, but was the first real contender to unleash the hellishly powerful Return from the Different Dimension on the Yu-Gi-Oh! World. But before I jump into the story, I think it's imperative to briefly explain how vastly different the game was during GX in comparison to today's Yu-Gi-Oh! This will help you better understand why certain cards were being played. During this time in the game, flip effect monsters were incredibly common in the meta decks. Going first, it was actually largely considered to be a better play to set a monster face down than to summon one in attack position. While this might sound crazy by today's standards, during the much slower era that GX was, the break my board or protect the castle style of Yu-Gi-Oh! That you know today, it just didn't exist, and that's because great stun boss monsters also didn't exist. Add that to the fact that the only extra deck mechanic that we had was fusion, and of course the infamous Thousand Eyes restrictive GOAT format spent half of the era limited to one and the latter half being banned entirely. So you kind of understand why setting a monster was considered the optimal play going first. After all, if you were only going to be putting one monster on the board, it was advantageous to make sure that it was face down so you weren't susceptible to taking battle damage unless piercing was involved. More importantly, a face down monster revealed absolutely no information to your opponent for free, effectively telling them, hey, go ahead and attack at your own risk. You have no idea what you're walking into. Now, just to be clear, I don't want to lead you into thinking that flip monsters had no counters, because cards like Noblemen of Crossout and the era-defining Cyber Dragon were used to capitalize off the passive setting of flip monsters. They were also very common in the meta. So to quickly summarize, in a super slow game where no one used their extra decks or special summoned often outside of Stein OTK, setting monsters was often safe and even practical. There were a few good ways of countering it, but definitely not enough to push people off the mechanic, which was always just a really solid play. Now, with introductions out of the way, shall we? For this story, we're going all the way back to the GX era, early 2006 around March. The game was in a very unique place, and what most defined the meta was the fact that just a bunch of good cards thrown together in a deck seemed to always work. If you're someone who doesn't like being beholden to the present design of Konami's archetypes, and you just love to go mad scientist when creating decks, then the GX era was definitely for you. At Shonen Jump Long Beach in early March, young Steven Adair won the event with what most in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community had dubbed cookie cutter chaos. This term was loosely used to describe any deck resembling his, a bunch of good standalone light and dark monsters thrown together and backed up by the mighty Sorcerer Supreme himself. One of the things you'll notice about this time from Steven's deck is that there were two types of cards that were incredibly popular. The first being those good standalone monsters like Breaker the Magical Warrior, Skellingale, Mystic Tomato, and Spirit Reaper. These cards were all very powerful in a vacuum and could be put safely on the field by themselves without the need of other aid. These cards were not only versatile, but many of them had some way of either replacing themselves with another resource or had the ability like Breaker or Spirit Reaper to straight up take cards away from your opponent. The second type of card was simple one-for-one removal like Smashing Ground, Widespread Ruin, Sakaretsu Armor, and Noblemen of Crossout. As strange as it sounds, these cards were all near staples at the time. This was because duels at this time were pretty much just a war of attrition. You knew when you sat down to the table, a duel was going to go no less than 5 full turns, and cards like these that had the ability to take out anything your opponent threw at you were incredibly valuable. As we entered April, the new format definitely added a bit of speed and aggression into the game. Noblemen of Crossout was moved from limited to semi-limited status, and Mirror Force and Graceful Charity were both unbanned. At the same time, however, open fields would be a a little harder to come by as Dark Hole was now banned. While the format still moved at a snail's pace compared to today's Yu-Gi-Oh!, Team Scoop's Shane Scurry saw a huge opportunity to exploit that. For this, he looked to the power of one particular under-the-radar card that had been released a couple of years prior. That card, as you may have guessed by now, was Return from the Different Dimension. During this time in Yu-Gi-Oh!, monsters were getting banished left and right. To summon Chaos Sorcerer from Bottomless Trap Hole by Nobleman of Crossout or DD Warrior Lady. So going into Shonen Jump Baltimore, which was the first Shonen Jump of the new format, a fairly unknown upstart player to this point named Shane Scurry asked himself, can we do anything with all of those banished monsters? It may seem obvious in hindsight, but by taking a standard cookie cutter Chaos deck and making a few adjustments, Chaos Return was born. Shane's first draft of Chaos Return was meant to be ultra aggressive and prey on the conservative players. He used some powerful flip monsters like Dekochi and Skelengale, but only one copy of each. Instead of maxing on those cards, he wanted to give himself more offensive options such as Mirage Dragon and Azura Priest. These are both invaluable when combined with Return. Mirage Dragon could lock out your opponent's defensive traps entirely, and Azura Priest could take out 2 or more set monsters on the field, thus opening your opponent up for, well, death by return. This strategy caught nearly everyone outside of his teammates off guard, and Scurry was able to win the event, but evolution and refinement for Chaos Return was still yet to come. At next month's Shonen Jump Columbus, the age of Chaos Return was on full display. It became immediately evident that Shane Scurry's idea had taken off. At Columbus, Chaos Return officially killed the older pure cookie cutter Chaos decks of old, even knowing the huge risks of activating a single copy of Return, which would always cost you half your life points. The yield was simply far too great for players to pass up. At Columbus, we saw Yu-Gi-Oh! Juggernauts like Jerry Wang, Lazaro Bolito, and Chris Perovic all embraced the card. In fact, every single duelist in the entire top 8 was running at least one copy of Return from the Different Dimension. The weeks between Baltimore and Columbus, as rigorous hours of playtesting were done, it became very clear that the debate wasn't whether or not to use Return, it was largely how many copies to use. 2 copies would mean seeing it more and obviously more chances to land a massive finishing blow, but it also meant twice as much risk. Return was effectively the greatest offensive trap we had ever seen, even more so than the mighty Ring of Destruction, which was banned at this time. And much like Ring, it came with a high chance of backfiring. I should mention right about now that Chaos Return was not a deck for the faint of heart. One of the reasons Monarchs and their many variants were so popular during the entirety of the GX era was because it was always seen as an incredibly safe deck. Very low risk plays, decent matchups with nearly everything from the many formats of GX, and the fact that Monarchs worked with so many engines well. The opposite side of the spectrum, however, with decks like Stein, OTK, and Chaos Return, were kind of like playing high-risk poker. You would simply play the standard grind game for the first couple of turns, but when Return was activated or Stein was summoned, you knew that you were going all in. Return had insane power, but it also came with insane risk. If someone was able to counter a Return with a well-timed Torrential Tribute or Mirror Force, they were surely in the driver's seat of the duel and were highly likely to win. This brings us back to that top 8 of Shonen Jump Columbus, which gave new meaning to the phrase go big or go home. Here stood the once legendary duelist Iman Ganin, who newer players might not recognize the name, but this guy won 3 Shonen Jump championships in the span of a mere 12 months. Unlike every other top 8 competitor at Columbus, Iman decided to completely throw caution to the wind and max out on Return, running an insane 3 copies in his deck. In doing this, he made one thing abundantly clear. He was going to live and die off of that single card. Iman further went against the grain by doing the exact opposite of what Shane Scurry had previously done at Baltimore. Where Scurry decreased his flip effects for aggressive monsters, Iman packed his deck full of Dekochis and even the newly introduced flip monster of the meta, Magical Merchant. This card was able to get him to powerful spell and trap cards instantly while filling his graveyard up with the light and dark monsters needed to summon Chaos Sorcerer simultaneously. Considering the only spell or trap card in Iman's Iman's deck that he ran at 3 was Return, he was banking on being able to consistently get to the card faster than any of his opponents. This was high-risk gambling at its finest, and it absolutely paid off for Iman. In his match during the finals in Game 1, that's exactly what happened to a T. Iman used Magical Merchant's effect a staggering 3 times in consecutive turns with the help of Tsukiyomi, the second time netting him a copy of Return, which he then used after his Cyber Dragon, which was tribute summoned, fell into a bottomless trap hole. He proceeded to summon that very same Cyber Dragon back along with other monsters for an OTK. After winning back-to-back Shonen Jump championships, it goes without saying that Chaos Return's dominance was in full effect over the meta. One of the reasons Chaos Return was so strong is because it was so fundamentally solid from all angles. The flip effect monsters like the Kochi, Magician of Faith, and Magical Merchant were all safe options to be set on the field, giving the deck the ability to play slow and steady, while at the same time it had powerhouses like Zaborg and Chaos Sorcerer to remove bigger threats and deal large amounts of raw damage. But what really put the deck over the top was its ability to throw a Haymaker, which was Return, and simply end the duel at any point. At the time, there were decks like Cyberstein that could OTK you just as easily, but you knew a deck like that was never going to outgrind you. Chaos Return was A+ on both fronts, so it was incredibly difficult to beat. During the next couple of months, Chaos Return variants would go on to win 3 more Shonen Jump championships, as well as the European and United States Championship. In fact, Iman Ganin would actually capture another title win at Shonen Jump Denver. While tech advancements like Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer were experimented with, as it could stop Chaos Sorcerer from ever hitting the field, the problem with that card was the other effect would actually fuel Return, so it could lead to you pretty much digging your own grave. The real game changer was the advent of Royal Decree into the meta. It had seen sparing play in some side decks, and Cyberstein OTK players never left home without it, but outside of a top 8 finish here and there, like Muhammad Ali's Chaos top 8 deck from the European Championship, it didn't really have a breakout performance until it did, which was the downfall of the Chaos Return deck. Enter Kyle Duncan and July's Shonen Jump Philadelphia. Here Kyle constructed a Chaos deck of his own, but one that was 100% tailor-made to absolutely crush Chaos Return, and he called this deck Chaos Recruiter. Kyle only main decked 4 traps in his entire deck, and 3 of them were Royal Decree, the perfect answer for an activated Return, as you'd not only negate Return but get half of your opponent's life points as well. He also opted to play only 1 flip effect monster in his entire deck, that being Magician of Faith, instead relying on recruiter monsters such as Mystic Tomato and Shining Angel. This gave him many more opportunities to go aggressive for small amounts of damage, where the Return decks would always have to rely on setting flip monsters first. He combined those recruiters with multiple copies of Creature Swap and Nobleman of Crossout to steal his opponent's valuable flip effects while running over his recruiters to reap their effects, or just banishing the flip effect monsters outright. The entire point of Kyle's deck was to have the same strong Chaos infrastructure as the Chaos Return decks he'd be facing, but at the same time making sure that 2 things never happened. The Chaos Return deck never got Return off because of the Royal Decree, and they never got their flip effects off because of Crossout and Creature Swap. Kyle's Chaos Recruiter attacked the 2 strongest elements of Chaos Return while not losing out on any inherent consistency, and effectively put the deck down for good. That brings us to the end of our story and the end of the run for Chaos Return. And if you've ever wondered why it seems like these Yu-Gi-Oh stories from the GX era cover so many different events and why the meta seems to evolve so rapidly, it's because Shonen Jumps occurred way more frequently than the YCS events of today. For reference, from the time that Iman Ganin won his first Shonen Jump in May, Columbus, which we talked about in this video, until the end of August, there was, get this, 7 full-on Shonen Jump championships. That's right, 7 championships in the span of 5 months. And this was during national season, so the European, US, German, Canadian nationals, they all happened as well. So this is why a lot of times the GX era evolves so much faster than today's Yu-Gi-Oh, where you'll have a deck like Chaos Return that'll be on top of the world and it'll seem unbeatable, and then just a couple of months later it'll be, a new deck that ends up taking the throne. It's because there were so many just Shonen Jump championships and there was always room for a lot of innovation. This is also one of the reasons why a lot of my Yu-Gi-Oh stories come from the GX era, because there's just so many different crazy events. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give this video a big thumbs up. There's actually another super amazing flip deck that I want to do a Yu-Gi-Oh story on. It's from the GX era as well, and I guess it can kind of be like a sequel to this video. If you guys do want to see that Yu-Gi-Oh story, please leave it in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already, and turn on that notification bell for daily videos. Subscribing makes life happy.